Our Salvation Born, Reflections on the Incarnation. Part 1, Where the Story Begins.
A long time ago in a far and distant galaxy, when I was a young man in graduate school in philosophy, I had a venerable and wise teacher who said that any good philosopher would have to deal with 4 fundamental questions, and they're questions that life itself asks. First question is, what should I believe and what is true? What can I depend and rely on? What is firm and what is steadfast? Second question is, how should I live? How should I conduct myself? Upon what basis should I make my decisions in life? What is of value such that I should seek after it? The third question is one that comes to us more acutely, I think, as we move through life. And that question is, what's wrong with the world? Oftentimes we experience that as we look around at the world about us and see so many broken relationships and so many broken promises and so many broken lives. Why is there so much violence and conflict between peoples and between even friends? And as perhaps we get more wisdom and insight, we realize that there's something wrong with us as well, which makes the question more personally pressing. The fourth question is, who am I and what am I to do? It's a question regarding our identity, and it's a question that can't be answered generically. It needs to be answered in a deeply personal way, because after all, it is my life, and it's the only life that I have. Christianity is concerned with all these questions. In fact, the central and foundational truths in Christianity have to do with these very questions. And it certainly is the case as we approach the great mystery of the Incarnation, which has to do with the second person of the Trinity entering into and taking on the reality of human nature, that we begin to see the response to these 4 questions. During this time of preparation for Christmas, we mostly focus on passages from the Old Testament that have to do with prophecies that have been given, that in some way foretell the coming of the one who is to save us from our sins. There are also many kind of foreshadowings or types or images in the Old Testament that point to the coming of the Lord at Christmas. All of these prophecies and types and foreshadowings are embedded in a story that has its beginning in the creation account itself. And in order to understand more deeply the meaning of Christmas and the meaning of the Incarnation, we have to go back to the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is found in the first chapters of the book of Genesis. And we read in the opening statement of Genesis that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that it was a formless void or a formless chaos. I can recall sometimes when I had younger children at home, as I'd walk into their bedrooms in the morning, I was reminded of that creation account where there was a formless void and all was chaos, and that God created everything that is out of nothing. And as we go through the creation account in the 6 days, we see that it's a very ordered process, that one step or one stage leads to the next, that there's a very definite sequence or very definite plan that's behind the creation account. And when we get to the summit of the creation story, which is the account of the creation of Adam and Eve, we see the end result of the whole creation account is to prepare a place in which the man and the woman could live, that it was to be a proper home for them. It was to provide an environment that would sustain them in their own lives. And as we go on in the creation account, we see how God created a garden. And then he placed the man and the woman in the garden to tend and to care for it. And the garden was called Eden, and it was, in fact, a paradise. In the first creation account in Genesis, creation account of Adam and Eve, in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, there's the famous line in which God says, "Let us make mankind in our image, in the likeness of ourselves." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This is a remarkable statement that has to do with our identity as human beings. And it's a statement of profound importance because it gives us a key insight into the question of who we are as human persons. That first of all, we are created, that we don't account for ourselves, that our coming into being wasn't a matter of spontaneous combustion or spontaneous creativity, but that we were the result of an action of God himself. And secondly, it tells us that we are created in the image and likeness of God. You know, sometimes when a child is born, people come down to see the mother and the father, congratulate them, and to ooh and ah at the young baby. And oftentimes, the friends that come down will say to the parents, "Oh, who does he or who does she look like?" And the parents can haul out baby pictures of their other kids and their own baby pictures and so forth. And so, well, he looks like his mom, or he looks like his Uncle Harry, or whatever it might be. As the child grows and gets older, there's a different kind of identity that begins to emerge. That doesn't have to do with who they look like, but rather it has to do with who they act like. Sometimes a person will say that this particular son acts just like his dad, that he's as tenacious and persistent as his dad, or that a young girl is as kind and sweet as her mother. That it has to do with not a physical resemblance, but a character or a dispositional resemblance. When it says that we are created in the image and likeness of God, it doesn't mean that we look like God on the outside. It means we look like God on the inside. That we have a mind like God by which we can know the truth. That we have a will like God so we can choose the good. And that we have affection so that we can be drawn toward the beautiful. You can ask the question, why did God create us in his image and likeness? Well, quite simply, he created us in his image and likeness because he wanted to have somebody in his creation with whom he could relate. That his desire was to be in a relationship with the men and women that he created. In the second creation account of mankind, we find another dimension to this creational story. And it says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, that God formed a person from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, so that he became a living being. That when God created man from the dust of the earth, that man had not yet become a living creature, that God had to infuse his own breath, his own life into the man and into the woman. It's a very moving image and a very telling image because it's particularly intimate and so profoundly personal, of God breathing his life into the man and into the woman. It is God's breath that gives each of us life. It's a telling image because it dramatically conveys a profoundly significant truth. And that's the simple truth that human beings have no independent source of life but God himself. One of the Psalms says that when God removes his breath from a human person, the person dies. There's a couple further elements in the story that are worth pointing out. One is recorded in Genesis chapter 3, verse 9. And it said that they, the man and the woman, heard the voice of God, and that God was walking in the garden in the time of the evening breeze. Again, it's a very touching image. It's an image of God coming in the late afternoon after the day has begun to cool. And he walks in the garden under these canopy of trees with the man and the woman. Again, it indicates quite clearly God's desire to be in a relationship with the man and the woman, that God, in a certain way, has created us for intimacy with him and intimacy with one another. And as they walked under this canopy of trees, that they would fellowship with one another. So again, God made them in his image and likeness so that they could be, in a certain way, partners with him. And God told them that every tree in the garden was given to them as food. Every fruit tree was given to them as food. And they would take the fruit from the tree that God had provided in the garden, and they would take it into themselves, and it would become a source of life for them. And there was one exception to this, and that was a tree in the center of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this tree is highly symbolic, and we'll see what the symbolism is in just a moment. There was another creature introduced in the story, and that creature was the serpent, who was cunning and wise in the embodiment of evil. And that serpent tempts Eve and Adam to take the fruit from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil and eat it. And if they did, that they would become like God. And they took the fruit, they gave in to the deception. And of course, this highly symbolic element in the story is centered on the tree itself, which represents a kind of grasping on the part of Adam and Eve at equality with God. That Adam and Eve turned away from entrusting themselves to God and entrusting themselves to the instructions and the directions that God had given them. And they turned to themselves out of a desire that they would become their own source, that they would become their own foundation. And this grasping, this turning away from God, had profound implications and profound results. God had told them that if they were to eat of this tree, that the moment they ate, their eyes would be open and that they would die. And certainly the death wasn't immediate, but they took that fruit of turning away from God into themselves, and what that fruit produced was not life and more life. What it produced were the seeds of destruction and death. Original innocence was lost and replaced with original shame. Harmony and ease in their relationship with God is replaced with discomfort and hiding and evasiveness. And they indulge in blame shifting and accusation with one another. The subsequent chapters in the book of Genesis and in the scriptures as a whole chronicle the acceleration of this downward spiral. In this mystery of the apple that they ate, in this mystery of them trying to usurp the place of God in their life, is indeed a great mystery. It has to do with the reality of what's wrong with the world and what's wrong with each person in the world. G.K. Chesterton once said, not so much tongue-in-cheek, but accurately, that the teaching of the churches on original sin is the only teaching that's empirically verifiable. And it certainly is true that the downward spiral is something that's graphically illustrated in the history of the human race. And so gone was the peace and tranquility they had in the garden, and gone was their time of intimate fellowship with God and their innocence in their relationship with one another. And gone is the harmony that they had in their relationship with nature. And gone is their life in the garden and their place in it. And gone is what St. Augustine called the tranquility of order, which has been shattered. And again, it's a great mystery of the reality of sin, but certainly its consequences are profoundly evident in the world that we live in and in our own personal lives. Human beings have tried for centuries and centuries to rectify this situation and to resolve it through medicine, through education, through technology, through pills and potions and exercises and psychology. But all those efforts have crashed into the immovable wall of death and decay. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty took a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But as the scriptures say, God did not leave Adam and Eve without hope, that God doesn't leave us without hope. As God was revealing to Adam and Eve the terrible effects of their action, he addresses a particular comment to the serpent. God says, "I will put animosity or enmity between you and the woman, and between your descendant and her descendant. He, that is, the descendant of the woman, will bruise or crush your head, and you, the evil one, will bruise his heel." This is the first prophecy given in the scriptures, and God himself is the one who utters it. It is referred to as the proto-evangelium, the proto-gospel. It provides a glimpse, a fleeting glimpse into the reality that God had, even at that time, a plan of restoration. And God's plan of restoration had to do with a descendant of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent, who would defeat and overthrow the evil one and cast him down, but who would also undo the effects of sin so as to restore the man and the woman back to their original place in God's creation. So even as Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden in tears and sorrow, that's captured so beautifully in the painting of them being driven out of the Garden of Eden by the angel, looking back over their shoulders with great sadness and disappointment. That even at that moment, God had provided them with some hope and some light for their future. But how that hope was to be realized was not yet revealed. And how that hope was realized is quite a story. There's an article that you can read that accompanies this reflection. It's by Athanasius, an early church father, and it's an excerpt from his writing on the Incarnation. There are also a series of scriptures that are included that it would be of some use, I think, for you to read and to reflect on.
This talk has been brought to you by Leaven for Living, a project of the Sword of the Spirit.